From now on, Tom.
So if you watch my language, you're going to bleep me.
Denise has to sign it.
Yeah, right.
Denise has to
You're
sign
not the one I
it.
worry about.
Oh, okay.
Yes. You can actually worry about me more than I worry about you.
There we go. We are live.
All right.
You want to start us out then?
Yeah, I got enough.
2 minutes.
Got a big purse there. Got a lot of money.
It's not an issue.
After I pay this water bill, I was $2,600 in the building.
We got 2 people.
To tell you, I'm not teaching my class Thursday.
Okay,
So probably Natasha won't be able to put the chairs back.
okay.
And if what happened to me last week, they fell on top of me.
What?
I lost my balance and the whole stack was.
Oh, wow. Oh, my.
Was I here when that happened and just ignored it?
I don't think so, because the guy from the blood bank, he was sitting
Okay.
over there and kind of ran over, do you need help?
I'd like to believe if that happened, I would respond to
So
it.
embarrassed, I'm like, I'm so embarrassed.
Yes, but you're also
Well, at
still
least you're
alive.
not hurt.
You're still alive. That's the important part.
Yeah, it just went, before I even took it
To-
off the ground.
To be embarrassed, you have to be conscious. So I'm okay with that.
Good thing it wasn't the new chairs with the arms. Those are about twice as heavy.
Yeah, and they have pointy edges.
Yeah, they do.
Well, we're about at our start time, and we're alive. This morning's gonna be a little bit different, only because I didn't preach yesterday, and so Tom is gonna lead off, but I will open with prayer, and then Tom's gonna prove that he can read Psalm 13 again. That's right. God, we welcome you at our table. We welcome you in the study. We welcome you in our lives. We ask that you would guide us, help us to understand what you have. Let us be selfish about this and look for what you're saying to us, to each one of us, that once we own your truth, we can share it with others. And so we thank you and praise you for being present here with us. Amen.
Amen.
Well, if you were with us on Sunday, you know that Tom's the one that preached, and because this is the text from the sermon, we're going to have Tom start out with it. And that doesn't mean I won't say anything, but Tom's going to say most of it. And I say that because what you guys don't get is when Tom and I sit and talk about these things, he has a lot of really great insight. I learn a great deal when we sit and talk about it. And so I want to be quiet because I want you all to get a chance to hear what Tom has to say. So take it away.
All right. Well, before we actually get to the text, I'll give a little preface. I edited this message so much. I mean, there was so much took out of it. And said, Pastor and I talked about it, and I said, I said, what was it I told you? I said, this could easily be an 8-week series on its own. And it said, and you were, what did you say about it? It said you could do a year and it would barely scratch the surface.
Yeah.
But the thing about why I told so many different stories about it, Bible stories, was that we always talk about, Jeff especially says that, look, if the Bible repeats itself, that's God saying this is important. If he repeats himself 3 times, he's saying, hey, this is really, really important. But the Bible, there's a theme that runs across the entire Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, where this just comes up over and over and over again. So it just can't be ignored, but I think we do so often. And then it hit me about how praise is just, I look at praise as a form of prayer, because that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's unhindered, unadulterated prayer to God. And you can't hold back when you're praying there. You don't have to be eloquent when you speak, when you praise. And it just comes out. Whatever's inside of you is coming out. But the thing of it is how we just take it for granted, and what a gift it is from God. Because the way I look at it is that praise is not, it's not about us. It's not about who we are. It's about whose we are. But more importantly, you think about it, when it comes to praise, God's not any less if we don't praise him. It's what you said about when we have the opportunity with offering that we can give back, that it's not, God doesn't need our wealth, but we're less if we don't give. It's the same thing with praise. If we're holding back, if we're not entering in, if we're not contributing to praise, that doesn't make God any less holy or worthy of it. It makes us less. But so as we get into it, reading the scripture, and that's what I love about it is how it's so says it's the David himself wrote this, and it just amazes me how from the beginning to the end, a man whose heart was truly after God, how it was the first verse to the last verse, and there's only 6 verses, how completely different he came across.
Yeah.
And it was it was prayer that changed everything in the middle of it. So we'll start at verse 1. How long, O Lord, will you forget me? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look at me and answer, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. My enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, for he has been good to me. I've been waiting all week for your take on that.
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head when you point out that the psalm pivots on prayer, and I think this is an outstanding illustration of, David starts where he is. God, will you forget me forever? Now, if we just take a minute to remind ourselves who David was, it's pretty clear God hasn't forgotten him. I mean, it is really kind of a ridiculous thing for David to say if you think about it. Have you forgotten? Let's see. I don't know. I helped you kill Goliath, let you stay a shepherd, gave you the gift of music. You're the king of you're leader of my armies. So how have I forgotten you, David? But this is where David's at.
This is today.
Yes, this is where David's at. He starts with, "Are you paying attention, God?" And I think that's
The word in the message is ignore, not forgotten.
yeah, ignore. Are you ignoring? Yeah.
Ignoring me.
Yes. Do you hear me? Are you out there? Does it? And I think one of the beautiful things about the Psalms is that they are very raw. David oftentimes says, "I've had enough. I want you to smash the heads of my enemies. I want this done." And that's not glorifying violence or suggesting that we can earn God's attention. It is the real response. You see, Tom, when you say that praise is prayer, I think that's such a critical thing to remember, because prayer is a form of communication. It is our communication with God, and praise is a key piece of that. And so we start out with, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? But he's speaking to God. And if you look at even Job, you look at if you read the entire book of Job in one sitting, first of all, call some friends and tell them you're doing that, and have them show up right as soon as you're finished, because it isn't going to be a particularly uplifting experience, perhaps. But through all of it and all of the assault, Job is able to continue praising God for what's happening, even though it hurts. Is and I think when you look at Job, the opening to Job, God says, "So, Satan, what have you been doing?" Just wandering around looking at who I can persecute. And God says, "Consider my servant Job." When he says that, I really believe that part of what that says to us is that God knows that Job will sustain this challenge, and the truth of the challenge is real. The things that Job loses, his friends that give him bad advice, and et cetera and so forth. But he continues to come back to praising God. It is counterintuitive, and I still think I'm trying to wrap my mind around how that works. How does Job make it through the most intense pain and sense of isolation? Because David in Psalm, are you ignoring me? Are you forgetting me? It's the same thing Job is saying. God, are you out there? And at the end, God doesn't say to Job, "You were a brilliant theologian and you got this all figured out right." He says, "Just a minute, Job. Where were you when I made Leviathan? Who was it that made these mountains?" Like, let's put into perspective who you are. So it's not Job's wisdom that gets him through, and it's not his circumstances that get him through, and it's not his friends that get him through. It's his ability to praise. It's his ability to say, "God, I know you're in this."
I think the roots of your faith too
like I praise you through the storm. You can go through, you've seen people that have, I mean, you always think if I'm worse out, there's always somebody worse than me. Somebody that's like Job lost his whole everybody. And even though you do go through a doubt phase or, you know, you feel broken, you still have those roots of your faith that you know God is always there.
Yeah.
Even all these horrible, evil things happen to you. And that you can he can bring you up through that and still be in victory. And to me, when I see somebody that's done that, gone through the most horrendous things you don't think they ever could come back from,
Yeah.
and they do, and they're even stronger in their faith. I mean, that's what a testament,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And many times when you have conversations with people like that, what they'll say is, I wouldn't ask anyone to get to this place the way I have, but I wouldn't trade my journey for anything.
Right.
I would not want
So
to
relate to
to
that.
right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing, we have to get it through our heads that no matter what, God is in control. He knows what's going on, and now Job, everything he went through, God told Satan that he could do this, but he could go only so far. He could not take his life. Well, of course, Job did not know about that conversation,
Right.
but still he knew that God was supreme. And he's the one that said, I know whom I believed, and my Redeemer, and then in the end, it will turn out all right. I've just really noticed lately how negative the Old Testament is, you know?
It certainly can feel that way, can't it?
It's smash my enemies, beat their heads on the rock, do this and that. And then, so that's when Jesus came along and said, forgive your enemies. It was really a momentous.
A breath of fresh air, wasn't it?
And it was
revolutionary.
it is hard to do. It is hard to say, God, you know them. And of course, they're worse off than you are. I don't care what they have done to you. They are worse off because they did it.
Yes.
So they need something, and God knows what they need, and you just pray that he will do it.
You know, I
And
think
then you
that's
shut up and sit down and wait.
I think that's a really important thing that you just mentioned. I want to repeat it. They're worse off than we are because they did it. And I think that understanding that fundamentally is hugely important. It really is, because God calls us to be compassionate. And I might not understand your behaviors, but one of the things that I've learned later in life is that when people are acting in ways that don't make sense to me, that even are angry and just straight up cruel, recognizing that they have a soul sickness that's very deep. And because if if they'd just been in a car accident and they were bleeding, I wouldn't worry about how they spoke to me. I wouldn't ask them to be polite or kind or understanding or anything else. I would simply see their suffering and respond to that, recognizing that in the midst of pain, we can't always be the best person that we are. And it doesn't, the way we respond in the midst of pain and persecution isn't necessarily who we are all the time. And reminding ourselves of that about people's attitudes and behaviors spiritually as well. The piece from Job for me that I think that I hang on to and come back to is in the first chapter. You don't need to go to it, but it's verse 21, where Job says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. And there's a heart of praise. If what's happening is wrong, then it's not coming from God. So whatever is going on, even if it's the evil that Job is experiencing from Satan, God has given Satan a limited amount of space and the authority to do these things, and so it is okay in the sense that God's in charge.
What I love about the Psalm, why I appreciate so much that David wrote it, is because David knew these troubles. His whole life had been troubles.
Yeah.
A father figure tried to kill him. I mean, his own family turned against him.
Yeah.
I mean, he did not have an easy life. But to what Denise said about how people come through that and they come through it stronger, I think about David saw, despite anything bad happen, and yeah, there might be a period of time where he's wondering, but he's asking God, how long? It's like, I know you're going to come. I know you're going to help get me through this. How long is it
Yeah.
going to be? But what I love, what really hits home though, is you talk about the strength that you can get through this. I think about when David lost his child at birth with Bathsheba, and it says when they gave him word that the child had died, it said that he simply got up and cleaned himself off, and then he went to Bathsheba, and they said, "Well, wait a minute, aren't you going to mourn?" But he recognized she needs me right now. She doesn't know God's goodness like this.
Mhm.
She doesn't have this strength. She needs to be comforted right now. I'll be okay
Yeah.
because God's going to be there. But she needed,
But
he
she
he
needed that.
recognized she needed that because he'd had that relationship
Yeah.
with God. He knew God was going to be there to comfort him.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Something that we don't often. David's life is so complex and so rich with you know, verse 2. How long must I wrestle with my thoughts? So just think about that. Is there much difference between that statement and the definition of clinical depression? I mean, I think clinical depression is that sense of wrestling with thoughts, and is it, having it every day have sorrow in my heart. I mean, I've been sad. I haven't suffered clinical depression. I haven't had that experience. But in the little bit that I've heard from people that have this notion that it's a constant battle, and that every single day begins and ends with sorrow, that there's not a way to avoid it. And so I think, and that's the truth. That's where David is in this psalm. Do I have to put up with this? How long? You know, and this way I say we don't talk about patience, because I think that a better translation for what we call patience would really be long suffering. It's patience is not this kind of generic waiting in line for the next available operator, but it's dealing with the garbage and the sorrow and the pain and it's the other piece of it is like you said, Tom. David sees something that maybe we don't see. David knows something that perhaps we don't know. His isolation, whether it's with, like you said, with Bathsheba, David's experience is bigger than perhaps what we understand. But when we come to the Psalms, especially, we're given these examples of what's an acceptable way to come to God. It's okay. I mean, I can tell you, I would have never imagined any Sunday school teacher I ever had saying, "Yeah, it's all right for us to pray. How long are you going to ignore me, God? Come on, get it together. Pay attention to me. Things aren't going my way. When are you going to step up to the plate?" I think the Sunday school teachers I had would have said, "Get behind us, Satan." Send a note to my parents saying he can't come back to this class because it seems like it's so wrong.
I think David's like every man on steroids. He does really bad things worse than almost any of us have ever done, and he does really good things better than anything of us done. And I was reading Charles Spurgeon said a thing that no matter how low I've ever been, David's always been below me, and no matter how high I've ever been, David's always been above me.
That's an interesting observation.
He's just there, and everything in here is the same kind of thing. And my version of that verse 2 says, "How long shall I take counsel in my soul?"
Oh,
And that's like he's trying to do it himself. He's taking counsel in his own soul.
yeah,
And then he kind of realized, oh, wait a minute, that's not how it's supposed to work.
yeah.
And we all do that. We all do all these things. So I think it's
That's a great segue, because that's when he turns to asking God.
I just, on the way here, David Jeremiah was talking about Corrie ten Boom and forgiveness. And at the time she was going all over Europe preaching forgiveness because of the things the Germans had done, especially to the Jews. And then there was one time this guard that she knew at Ravensbrück came up to her and asked her to forgive. And she thought, oh, here I am, I've been going around. I don't think I can do this. And so she had God help me. And she said immediately she felt different. And that's it. We can't, it's endurance too. I don't think it's patience so much as it is endurance, waiting for God to work. And he's not on the same timetable we are by any means. Unless it is needed right away, then he's there. But then she was able to forgive him, really, truly, she was.
Uh-huh.
But it was
Yeah.
only with God's help.
Well, and you know, that's an interesting story because that's a person who in that context was actively talking about forgiveness and was teaching and leading. I mean, she clearly is a leader, and yet in the midst of all of that, recognizing I need help. I'm not on top of this game. I need help in this. And I think that one of the reasons that I'm adamant about the generic statement, if it matters to you, it matters to God, is because too often we think God knows about it, so I don't have to tell him. God's aware of this, I don't have to tell him. But our faith is not a transaction, it's a relationship. And if we're in relationship with God, even though I know he's going to do something about it, I still need to exercise that relationship, because if nothing else, it reminds me of whose I am. God knows what's going on. I don't necessarily need to inform God. However, if I don't mention it, what parent or friend, if you find somebody that you care about deeply was going through some kind of trouble and didn't ask you because they didn't want to bother you, um, you would be discouraged. We don't want that. And if they said we didn't ask you because we don't want to bother you, that's one thing. But what if they said we didn't ask you because we didn't think you'd do anything? Now that's no longer a friendship. But if God's able to help me in absolutely everything and he asks me to come to him with everything, then what does it say about my relationship with God if I don't come to him? Here's the key for David. He gets to those places because he continually involves God in what's going on. Even you think Bathsheba is a perfect example. You can't mess up as a king much more than he did. But he doesn't leave God out of it, and God doesn't leave him out of it. And it's really, to me, it's mind-boggling how, in that context of with Bathsheba, how did David allow God to lead him through that? In the midst of all of that, God's still there and still leading, and David's still listening. The tragedy would be to cut off God completely because of one mistake, one misstep, one error. What we see in David is you can always pivot. You can always pivot from the self-centered life to a God-centered life, and that's what this central prayer. How long will my enemy triumph over me? I mean, I think how much of our lives do we live identifying enemies? And we might not always call them enemies, but if we're in line and need to get someplace and we're about a minute and a half behind and the light hasn't turned yet, or the person in front of us, the light turned and they didn't respond right away, we kind of treat them like enemies, right? I mean, like we might be really kind and not laying on the horn for a long time. We might be really proud of ourselves that we didn't honk at all. But in our own heads, it's like, here's something standing in the way of my effective living. It's like my agendas, but again, that's real. It's not just because David's a king. As I think if it was, for David in the Psalms, I think pretty good at differentiating between those enemies that are enemies of God first. And he says, oftentimes our sin is against you first and foremost. But in Psalm 13, David, these are his own personal enemies. These are the ones that are attacking him. And he says, speak up.
Does commentary have a note as to where David was in his life when he wrote this? Sometimes he was out in the
This is for the
wilderness,
director of music of Psalm of David.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just the director of music.
I don't have a copy. Another day in the life of David.
I think
Is it before Bathsheba or after? Like, I didn't even
Right.
know that.
Well, the thing you talked about enemies, is you said you've never been there when you're clinically depressed. I talked about suicide yesterday. When you get to that point, you really can't trust anyone. You almost get paranoid, and you wonder, and that's why it's so difficult to turn to anyone, because you don't think you can trust anyone. And that could have been what he was going through.
That's exactly what in the ESV for Psalm 13, it says, this is an individual lament for circumstances where the worshiper is at the verge of despair. His powers of endurance are spent, which is exactly what you just said.
Well, that's what with God. And you talked about how, because you brought up, I was brought up that way too. You can't be angry at God. If you're angry at God, then you're the one that's wrong.
Yeah.
And I remember when 10 years ago, every day when I drive, I had half-hour drive back and forth to work, and I just turn out the radio and I'm praying, and the whole time I'm going, God, I know I'm wrong, but I think it's okay. I think God says it's okay to be angry. Just talk to me. And don't give me this fabricated, don't give me BS. He goes, just talk to me, be honest. What are you really going through? Because I can help you through this, but you need to talk to me. And sometimes I think when we do that, when it comes out, when we actually pray to God, I think it's not so much so he can hear it, because he already knows, like you said,
Yeah.
we need to hear it.
Yeah.
He knows that we need to hear it coming out.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that writing is really a form of prayer. And I did this in college, and actually when you were sharing the message yesterday, it just overwhelmed me that I did this at a really low point when I had just graduated from college, and I did it actually all through college as well, at really low, lonely points. And I would always turn by the end of the rant, I guess it was the written rant, and the sadness, and feel so hopeful at the end of it by writing it out. And I really was writing it out to God, because who else was I going to talk to? I didn't have anybody. And it's kind of cool to realize, I now would be like, why would we take the time to write it? It just seems like so easy to just talk to him, but I guess I didn't know how. Like, why was I writing it? It was more natural for me, I guess, because I was majoring in writing. I don't know. That was my major. So it's really kind of cool to.
So I want to read the Psalms of Lynn.
Yeah.
And it's weird because I found the book. I didn't even have a lock on this thing. It was just like an open pad. But it was my deepest thoughts that I just left around. I moved it, had kids, went on with life, found it in one of our moves, and thought, wow, what a downer. But how hopeful it was at the end. Like, it really worked for you. It brought you closer to God. It was a huge turning point in my faith. It was a bonding with God time. And
I think that's what the Psalms were for David.
Yeah. I think
people don't go through this. Their faith is just scratching the surface. Like, we don't. I sort of feel sorry for people who haven't been in this place, but that's terrible. I mean, it's a terrible place to be. But do you know what I mean? Like, how will you ever get close to the Lord? This is real. Like, this is a true relationship.
I think it's really valuable to point out the value of journaling. I mean, so much of the spiritual literature that we have is really the result of journaling. There is in written text matter that we have the Old Testament, we have the book of the law inscribed in stone. So there is a value to that expression, and saying, in that pivot section, look on me and answer, O Lord my God, give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. How is that? That's so much, at least from my perspective. That's the prayer of somebody who's depressed. Let me see light, or I'm done. I don't know, and it isn't the threat or the suggestion of suicide, because I think even that takes energy. This is I may sleep in death. Like, it's just going to all end. Like, I'm not even going to get out of bed.
I do have a note that says a serious illness, possibly they wonder, and that refers back to Psalm 6, where he talks about his bones wasting and stuff like that, where he isn't feeling well, maybe. But and it says, who praises you from the grave? It's sort of a repeated thing, like, I'm so close to death, I really want to praise you, but I can't.
Keep me alive so I can tell somebody.
Yeah, right. Save me so I can.
Well, maybe that's why he's still alive. We can't. But and the idea that my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. I mean, it's a conversation about spiritual warfare. This is about a battle that's going on for David.
What I love about that, when he's praying, he's not praying for God to change the circumstances to make everything better. He's saying, God, strengthen me.
Yeah.
Change me.
Right.
I give you permission to work on me.
Yeah. Help me to be in line with your truth. Help me to understand. In some ways, when you say that, it makes me think a simple way of summarizing the prayer is that David's saying, help me understand your agenda. Let me know that this is your agenda. Let me understand. Like, it's not about so much about changing circumstances as perspective. Like David's kind of saying, listen, when I look at the world, when I see things going on around me, it looks like it's Armageddon. Nothing's going well, nothing's going to go well, and nothing is going to get better. And so instead of changing the circumstances, David's saying, we see that pivot happens in verse 5, but I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. And we know that David understood that this salvation, this deliverance is a future thing, not a, it's not, everything isn't right in the kingdom yet. The tribes are still fighting, and there's all kinds of dysfunction.
Just a quick note too. I love how he always says, because even in Psalm 51, he says the same thing. Restore to me the joy of your salvation.
Yes.
He never
Yes.
calls it save my salvation. He always calls it.
Yes.
Well, the one thing on verse 4, he's talking about his enemies, and so they say, I have prevailed against him. It's like he just doesn't want to be embarrassed.
Yeah.
Then on verse 5, he's got the big butt.
Yeah.
Pee Wee Herman says everybody has a big butt. Well, this is his big butt. All these things, I don't want to be embarrassed, but I have trusted in your mercy. So
Yeah.
that's really irrelevant now. It just the switch turned.
Yeah. Yeah.
Must have been later in his life too, after, and he definitely wasn't feeling up to par, let's say, because in Goliath, I mean, what would be bigger than that? And he was
Good
young,
point.
and yet he says to everybody, well, God's going to take care of this.
Yeah.
So he knew from this time he was very, very young that was it. So
Yeah.
he is depressed evidently
Yeah.
at this time, for what reason we don't know. But and of course, and he when he was younger, he wasn't worried about enemies. He just would pray, and should I go? Go and
Yeah.
slaughter.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If we look at it from his history, he's already taken out Goliath. What bigger challenge is there? And yet that the psalm doesn't give us the impression
Right.
that God's saying you should know this. It's not. It isn't. It is. And I mentioned journaling, but I think that the same is true of spoken prayer. We might not need to necessarily write it down, but saying, you know what, God, I'm done with this. I'm over. I don't want to do it for another minute
already.
I don't want to put up with all this. And okay, so convince me that you still love me. Prove to me. Open my eyes. It's what when he says, "Give answer to me." Open my eyes. Give light to my eyes. So my enemy doesn't say I've beaten him. So the rejoicing isn't in my enemy, and the rejoicing turns from those who would defeat him to rejoicing in the one who brings David victory. And it's interesting that the pivot is outside of himself. It's the foes that are going to destroy him. It's God that's going to rescue him. But David is the key actor in the middle, and that's who we are. We're in that space of help me understand what's going on. And no amount of praise, prayer, victory in battle, overcoming the forces of evil, or having a prosperous kingdom, or treaties with other kings, no amount of success put David in a position where this wasn't a reality for him as well.
I feel like God has answered the prayer as he's praying it. And
Yeah.
that's how I always felt
Yeah.
at the end, because he writes it out. He writes out all the things that are upsetting him, dumps it down, pause as you're writing, and then you think, you listen and you think, what else do I want to say here? And maybe you had that wash right before verse 5. I trust in your, I have hope. You've just restored it. Like however God does that for us, however he answers us with that feeling of hope, maybe he had it at that moment. And that's what, so the prayer was answered in the prayer, maybe, like right
Yeah.
in the moment of the prayer.
To Jean's point, the last line of this psalm is, I'm so full of answered prayers. He remembers
Yeah.
how many
That's what your
times he's
translation
prayed,
says. I'm
and
so
it has been
full.
answered, like Gina said, from the time he
Yeah.
was a kid. slaying Goliath. He remembers the answered prayer.
Yeah.
When you hit your lows, you tend to reflect on that. You
Yeah.
know, what's he done for me all my
Yeah,
life?
that's, I said, I think that's where the strength and faith comes from, because he
Right.
had been through it.
And we're doing this in the context of worship. And so Psalm 14 goes right into the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Now, I don't want to suggest that these are distinct pieces arranged the way God wants them arranged. It's not like it's a historic text from beginning to end, but I think it's important to recognize that for some reason we have these two psalms bumping up against each other. The answered prayer, and then the fool says in his heart, there is no God. It's almost like David saying, I'm not going to go back there. I need to hang on to what I know to be true. And
One of the things when I edited yesterday, one of the verses I really want to talk about, but I was restrained from time, was Isaiah 57.
yes, let's go there.
Verse 15. And here's another where just the verse alone is split into two. When you read the first part to the second part, we were talking about worship. In verse 15, it starts out, for this is what the high and lofty one says, he who lives forever, whose name is holy. I live in a high and holy place. But this is where the switch happens. But also with him who is contrite and lowly in spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite. So God, who is the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, there is no one higher, and yet he's still present. He can be on the throne, but he's also with the ones that are lowly in heart, that are brokenhearted at the same time.
I will not accuse forever, nor will I always be angry. Then the spirit of man would grow faint before me. The breath of that I have created. I was enraged by his sinful greed. I punished him and hid my face in anger. Yet he kept on in his willful ways. We don't learn quickly, do we? I have seen his ways, but I will heal him. I will guide him and comfort him, creating praise on the lips of the mourners in Israel. Peace, peace to those far and near, says the Lord, and I will heal them. Israel gets in a great deal of trouble, but God has promised and declared that he will preserve a remnant of that kingdom, of his people. And that you see that throughout the psalm, and that God is saying, why my battery's running low. God's not saying my battery's running low. It's my laptop that's saying that. I think we're fine. We'll see. See if that helps. Anyway, I'm gonna go get another power source. Let's continue. You could go offline halfway through. It looked bad on Jim's record.
Yeah.
No, but it just amazes me that it's those two passages seem to line up so well together. And it was written so many years ahead or so centuries ahead of that. But that's what struck me though, about how it starts out talking about this is where God is. He's here. He's up on the whole. There is no one higher. And yet he himself chooses to be with the lowly in heart, the ones that are brokenhearted and contrite in spirit.
Those who he created. Unfortunately, in the garden, we proved ourselves as broken people and
As human.
very fragile.
But the thing about praise, though, too, I think is it's an acknowledgement of God. There's so much you could say about praise. Like you said, you could go a year and barely scratch the surface. But I believe it was always the Father's heart to create beings like us that would constantly be discovering or rediscovering even his goodness, his faithfulness, his love, but then be able to not only acknowledge, but to respond to it as well. So, Mary Jo, I'm just curious that how does verses back in Psalm, when he actually says the prayer in verses 3 and 4, how does that read in the Message?
Has it already.
Well, my version doesn't have them numbered, but that would be about the middle.
Right.
Take a good look at me, God, my God. I want to look life in the eye, so no enemy can get the best of me or laugh when I fall on my face. And then he goes on to say, I've thrown myself headlong into your arms. I'm celebrating your rescue. So he knew that it was, God was going to take care of the situation. I'm singing at the top of my lungs. I'm so full of answered prayers. But as I said, it's always today. God has done all this for us in the past. Out of things that we didn't even know we were into, you might say. And yet today, is he gonna listen? Is he gonna do anything? It's such a human thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
We're an impatient people.
oh, absolutely. I want patience and I want it now. You know, that's
Exactly.
Hurry up with that. But you're right,
But
it's
the
relevant.
day to the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. So
But you're
you
right,
just
Gene,
hope he don't tell you tomorrow.
how relevant that is. This was written like 3 millennia ago, and yet
Yeah.
today, how often in
Absolutely.
society people be like, God, did you forget about me?
Mhm.
And they just people feel forgotten or feel ignored.
Yeah. After going through the Second World War in the country, churches were full because people were praying, everything. And then after afterward, the factories got back into producing things and so on and so forth. And well, we don't need God anymore, really.
You saw that at 9/11
Yeah,
too.
just
Yes.
after 9/11, same thing.
Yes. It takes sad enough, it takes a tragedy to get
But you
people.
think it would be the opposite, that they,
Yeah, wouldn't
now
you?
they're convinced and then it would stay full,
You
like,
would think.
look at all this, look,
But
I don't understand
looks
you.
like
they go back to worldly.
Well, that's where the
ambitions and-
Israelites were, and we
Well,
wonder,
actually is true.
how stupid could they be? They went through the sea thing and all this, and he's doing these miracles. And then
And they turn to false
they
gods and-
worship a
yeah.
golden calf. I mean, what
Yeah.
about these people? We do the very same thing.
Well, that's the point I was trying to make. I wasn't trying to be like political or anything yesterday when I was talking about Asbury with these youth that they just wouldn't leave. They would not leave the chapel. That's how it started. And then when people were experiencing God, people from all over, literally all over the world now have traveled there to be a
Mhm.
part of it. But I think a lot of that stemmed from the last few years when the government and everyone said, you can't go to church, you can't go to Bible studies, you can't do these things.
Mhm.
And I think the youth were the ones that said, because youth are a little more rebellious, maybe they're the ones leading the way, say, no, we're going to worship God. We're tired of you saying that we can't be together and do this.
Oh. And that's a human reaction. It seems you see that in China, you see that in Iran. The biggest Christian movement in the world is underground church led by women in Iran, and which is incredible.
And the growth in China is the same way.
Yeah. In China, if you say you're a Christian, the first thing they'll ask, when were you in prison?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were putting up pictures
Still
of
alive.
taking down all
If you're
the
alive.
icons and so on, and putting pictures of President Xi. You're supposed to worship him. That's in the churches they left standing. Most of them they tore down. So
And you're right, Lynn, it's contrary because the Great Commission, Jesus said that was what he told us to do. He says, go out and preach the word as be my witness to all the world. And for 15 years, they just stayed right there in Jerusalem until finally the great Rome moved in and said, all right, break everything up. And that's when they finally traveled. The disciples went everywhere.
Yeah, Nero made a major decision in Jerusalem and it started the started the growth of the church. Nero, the enemy of the church, started the growth of or it was used by God in that. And I think we're talking a little bit about worship and that the essential part of worship and the reason it becomes an issue is the fundamental truth about humanity is that we worship. We do. It's like, don't ask the question, what am I teaching? Don't ask the question, am I teaching? Know that you're teaching. If you're raising children, you're teaching something all the time. They're learning, they're paying attention. And worship is something that human beings do. And so power figures, especially ones like Pharaoh, understand fundamentally that we become like the thing we worship. And so if you are worshiping Egypt, you're going to become more Egyptian. That's the way it is. And that then puts a threat in when if the issue is the power struggle and the problem that Israel had in its history was an attempt to be a geopolitical power and unique in that regard when God had really called them to be a witness to who he was as a loving and patient God. The really, Israel's calling was to represent the truth of who God was, not to be a powerhouse in that area. And so as worship focuses on who God is, the people stay consistent. But they forget. That's one of the big sadness in Ezra and Nehemiah. They got scattered. They weren't allowed to be. They weren't able to be in the place of worship. They weren't able to be in Jerusalem, the temple where God lived. And when the declaration was made, you can go back and worship. Only a small percent went back because worship changes us. If we begin the things that we find affinity to, we might not recognize it as worship. But I don't know why when you go to a football game and you see a whole bunch of people who painted their face a certain color, why we don't realize that that's a form of worship. I mean, it just is. I'm not suggesting it's idolatry, but that's the reality. When we have an affinity about something, when we pay attention to something, we take on its characteristics. So you know what team somebody's on by what they're wearing on the outside. There's no better way of illustrating that, and that's why praise is so important, because it is our defining, our putting on of who God is. God is worthy of praise, always. Circumstances aren't, my performance isn't, the performance of somebody else isn't, but regardless of everything else that's happening, I can always sincerely and honestly praise God. And that, the blessed be your name, that song just, any time, any place, God can be praised.
That's why I love what Denise always says about how worship can be messy. And I love it because it gives us that freedom to be like that. I automatically thought of the woman that washed Jesus' feet. Those weren't tears of sorrow, those were tears of joy. And he made them uncomfortable, but Jesus said she gets it. She's been to that place where you haven't been. She knows, she recognized her Savior, her Redeemer.
And I think it's also, are we still in Isaiah?
No, we went back to Psalms.
Went back to Psalms, because there's a flip side to this. We've talked a lot about the pivot in prayer, but there's also the possibility. Let's see. Let's just go to Psalm 18. And it says in the superscript, he sang the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress, my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge. He is my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I am saved from my enemies. The cords of death entangled me. The torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. The cords of the grave coiled around me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress,